And we are now live. Hard to believe that. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So, welcome. We can't see you, but hopefully you can hear us now. So, I have my close friend, somebody I've known since high school days. Well, actually, no, that's not true at all. But um, Amanda is joining me today, and so we're gonna go ahead. Amanda, say hello before I
Hi,
brag on you a
everyone.
little bit.
Nice to see you.
All right. So, Amanda, do you go by Amanda Rose Smith, or do you?
Oh, just Amanda's fine. Having such a common name with the Smith, I just learned to use the Rose because it helps differentiate me from the 500,000 other Amanda Smiths in the world. But just Amanda's great.
Okay, Amanda. Uh, so that works for me. So for those of you that don't know, Amanda's done, north of 500 books. She's worked with just amazing people over the years, and she's forgotten more about editing and post-production and making this stuff work than anybody out there on the planet. So we're going to talk about punch and roll a little bit today, and we're going to have a good time. We've designated an hour for this, but we
Hmm.
may end early. And we're managing multiple screens here. I'm gonna mute.
Yes, there may be times where it switches back and forth between the two of us depending on who talks, or so bear with us.
So we're figuring that out, and we have somebody else who's trying to join in here, but we're gonna kind of go with it here. So the assumption is that you want to know a little bit about punch and roll and what's happening there, and so we're gonna make it happen by showing you a little bit about punch and roll, and then we're gonna go through and we're gonna have a dialogue about it. And we have some questions that we've put together because people have been sending me questions all day long, and Amanda and I will dialogue them. Both of us have Facebook up in another window, so if you see us glancing from you over to our other alternate monitor, it simply means that we are looking and reading your questions. If you want to get us through Facebook, feel free to go ahead and do that. We can't guarantee we can get to all of them today, but we're going to have somewhere, so less than 60 minutes. And if we get done early, then we'll go out and have a good time someplace else. So the first thing is, for those of you that haven't done punch and roll, there's going to be a bunch of you that are going to be bored for the first few minutes here. You already know how punch and roll works. You already know everything about it, and you're coming looking for maybe some details or some tips and tricks and things like that. That's cool, but I need to set the foundation for the few people here who haven't done punch and roll already. And so we're going to take a look at Studio One's version. Now, we're not here today to tell you use Studio One. Amanda uses Pro Tools and Reaper, and I've used quite a few others, and we're happy to talk to you about some of the different options you have. It's not about one piece of software today. It's about the concepts, making sure you're aware of them, giving you a place where you can start looking at it and saying, how could you make your process more effective and more interesting? Now, before I show the demo, Amanda, anything that I missed in that? Anything that we should talk about in addition?
No, I think until we watch the demo, that sounds pretty solid. Again, just this is something that can work in many programs. There are some programs that can't do punch and roll. So at some point, you might want to switch over to one of the ones that can if it works for you. But once you do, the techniques are pretty similar across the board. So,
Okay, great, thanks. Now what I'm going to do, just so you know from a procedural point of view, I'm going to switch and I'm going to share a screen. And when I do that, when I share the screen, your screen could go blank for somewhere around 10 seconds while it's switching over. So if your screen goes, then you'll know what's happening there. And I'll just give you the lay of the land here. I'll talk about it and it should come up on your screen here in just a second. But this happens to be Studio One that's sitting here. Here's my audio track. I made it red just for the demo so you could see some of the places in terms of this was a punch-in point. And what I'm showing you now, just so you see, at some point in the past I recorded roughly 10 minutes of audio. And if I needed to come in later, one of the great things, there's a whole bunch of things that separate the programs that do punch and roll from the programs that don't, and we'll talk about those. But one of the things that's interesting is this was recorded maybe 2 weeks ago, and the points that I punched in, you can kind of see them. I'll put a little keystroke here, right there. Now, maybe, hopefully, you're a stronger narrator than me, but those are in that particular 10, 12 minutes there. There's maybe 15 little segments. This was medical things. I didn't know all the words. I had to look them up. I couldn't pronounce some things. But whatever, I took all those takes. No one will know when we're done that I took all those takes. But this is what's interesting. When I go and look at one of those little punch-in points here, and you can see one that's right about here, I can go back 2 weeks later, and even though the punch-in occurred earlier, I can go back and I can do some things where I could drag from one side to another. I can change the crossfade, and depending on where I grab in this piece of software, I can go back and expose a couple seconds of audio that was recorded long ago. And what that allows me to do is, if I find out later that I had cut off a breath, if I had cut off something accidentally, I can go back and get that breath back. So punch and roll has a couple different components. One of them is when I'm going to come in and start here, the program is going to automatically pre-roll for me, and that allows me to listen to what I've recorded before. So in this case, I'll do it with the mouse. I should tell you, the power users, people that have been doing this a while, almost always have keystrokes set up for some of this stuff. But I'll use the mouse so you can kind of see what I'm doing here. And at this point, when I press record, it's going to pre-roll. Now's my pre-roll. You can't hear it. It's playing on my end. And then the recorder starts. And if I want, I can stop it. And that was recording for me. But what the beauty of that is I just recorded over this section here, and I recorded garbage in this particular case. But I get a chance to listen to the sound before, to listen to my pacing, to listen to the inflections that I had. 2 weeks later, my voice is going to be a little different, and now I have it that I can listen to it and make sure I match what was done before. Now that doesn't always work, so sometimes I'm going to go through with punch and roll. I'm going to Control Z and undo that and start that again. Sometimes I get to do that 2 or 3 times. Some people say to me, well, I don't do punch and roll because I make too many mistakes. And I always think, boy, that's the real reason to do punch and roll, because if I'm punching and rolling, when it's doing its pre-roll here, and then at this point I'm narrating something that is really brilliant and you would love it, but I'm not going to show it to you all. But if I make a mistake in here, sometimes I keep going and all I do is press Control Z, and now I'm back to the same point, and I now can start my pre-roll again. And you can't hear it, but it is playing back in my monitor. It'd be playing back in my headphones, and then it recorded again. So the beauty of that is this. If somehow I did not punch in at the exact spot, it also, behind the scenes, got the couple seconds before that. If I accidentally cut something off because I set my cursor a little bit too far one way or another, I can readjust that later. With a combination of punch and roll and non-destructive editing, I get a chance to adjust things and make them nearly perfect, even if I make a mistake in the recording process. And remember, this is about being an artist. It's about being an actor. It's about being a narrator. I don't want to have to fuss over every possible little thing during the narration. And one of the great things about this is later I can tune it to the exact insertion point that it needed to be. And if there was a breath that I missed, I could go back and get it before, after, and you can make it so nice and smooth. So I'm just showing a couple things about it. And Amanda, I'm going to switch back to the normal view, and we'll talk about it, and then we'll come back to more demo about it here in just a couple minutes. So let me stop this. Now, I need to ask Amanda. Amanda, what didn't I
Yes.
talk about there that I should have talked about in terms of punch and roll and advantages, and why in the world, who cares? Why don't I just do, well, what I did originally? I should tell you that when I started, somebody told me that I could just click my fingers and then I would redo it again, and then I would go back and edit that out. And I was a pretty good editor because I had hundreds and thousands of hours of editing from music before I ever did this. So I was really a hotshot. I thought I was good, but I just snap my fingers and then edit out later. Why is this a better strategy or a different strategy? What's the word when I do it with punch and roll versus when I do, say, finger snaps or just keep going and re-say the same line 3 times?
Well, the first thing I would say is, we're both musicians, so that helps with this. And imagine you're singing a song, right? Because voice has a music to it, whether you're singing or speaking, and you stop and you come back to it 10 seconds later. Do you think the flow is going to be the same? Is the meter going to be the same? Is it going to sound completely in tune? No. No, it's not going to sound like that. And that's an important distinction to make because it's also true of a conversation. And it's also true of recording a book. And especially, you mentioned some people say, well, I make too many mistakes, right? And you mentioned that that was actually better for people who make a lot of mistakes. And it is, because if you read a sentence and you read, say, 5 or 6 takes, and then eventually you get the take you want and you keep going, you're now 5 takes away from the last full sentence that you had. And, a lot of people do believe that their cadence stays, relatively the same, but it really doesn't for barely anybody. And it doesn't matter if it's fiction or nonfiction or anything. There's always going to be subtle variations. And no matter how good an editor you are, this is true, because I can edit things to sound smooth in terms of the audio, but I can't make your tone sound the same as it's going to have sounded, 3 sentences ago. And it's just one of those things where, the listener, they might not be able to put their finger on it. They might not be able to say, oh, that was a bad edit, but it will disrupt the flow of your narration, and it will bring people out of the story. One thing that I have told Don before is, there are still a lot of big publishing houses, as people will hear, that don't do punch and roll record. They do open record. And there are a couple things to keep in mind with that. First of all, is that they have 2 layers of QC. So not only do they send out for editing, after the entire thing is edited and completely done and mastered and everything, they also send out to a whole other QC. They all do this. And the reason why they do this is because when you're not punch and roll recording, you're going to find that there are a lot more repeats, missing sentences, mistakes, and that kind of thing. And when you are QCing one of those titles after it's been edited, in my experience, because I've QC'd a lot of them, you're going to hear all the edit points, every single one of them. Maybe not initially. It does take a certain level of concentrated listening to really know what you're hearing, but the flow is absolutely disrupted.
Well,
And
I have a question for you then.
sure.
Well, what about, all right, I mean, when I'm narrating, I'm acting,
hmm
and isn't that whole process going to take me out of my acting or my narrating or my being wonderful?
You know, I don't think so. I actually think it has, once you get the hang of it, which, don't get me wrong, there is a learning curve. No one should go into this expecting to think that the first day they try it, it's going to be way easier than any other method. It won't be. It's going to take a little bit of time to learn. But once you do learn it, I find that it actually keeps people in the flow. One good example is a lot of times when people take a certain sentence over and over again, they tend to get a certain amount of frustration in their voice, right? You say something once, it doesn't work. You say it again, it still doesn't work. You say it the third time. I find that when people are sort of forced to take, 1, 2, 3, 4 seconds, however long the pre-roll is, take a breath, and then continue, I find that it actually helps them get back into the zone and to continue on with the previous tone that they had, in the rest of the book. So,
Okay, well, and I find that, I used to teach drums, and I've taught very complex things to people, how to do things where they're tracking multiple things at once. And every time I've taught somebody punch and roll, if they've already have some experience using another method, they are terrible at it to begin with. And I've gotten to the point where I just tell them, you know what, the first chapter or two, it's going to take longer, and it is going to pull you out because you have a new habit, you are doing new things while you are acting, and there's not a whole lot you can do the first day, the first chapter, because you have to go through that process of learning it. And some people give up too early on this process. There is a learning curve, and I'm pretty straight with them. Don't expect your first book to have it easy doing this. You are going to take on something new, and it takes a bit to get comfortable with that new habit. But like every other habit, there is this nice crossover point. And so let's talk about editing when we're done, because it'll tie into this. If I do, say, punch and roll recording, and I hand it off to you, and I'm going to pay you for a certain amount of work, what's the workload like differential between somebody who's handing you something that's punch and rolled versus something that is, click edited or otherwise?
well, it really depends on the actor and on the book. On a book like the one you just showed us with all those medical terms, it could be easily a quarter of the time, you know, and that's significant.
Okay,
But even
well, let me ask. So let's say I have you do 2 hours worth of my audio, and that's going to take, if I'm doing the click method, the average person is going to take what, 4 to 6 hours to edit that? Is that what do you know in terms of that?
2 hours of material,
Yeah, two finished hours of book. What's the
Of
editing time for most
but
people?
unedited though, with the click method, is that what
Yeah,
you're saying?
yeah.
Depending on how many mistakes have been made,
Hmm.
it could be easily a ratio of more than 4 to 1 per an hour. So if it's 2 hours, it could end up being 8 hours of editing. I mean, it really depends on the actor. But if they've got a lot of start and stopping, it could be it could be five, six, it could be a ton. It just really depends on how much they start and stop. Even if they don't start and stop a lot, it'll be probably, I'd say, a 4 to 1 ratio.
Okay, so let's quantify that then. So that means if there's a new person who's doing a book, and let's say they're a great editor, so they're doing 4 hours. Now, to be honest with you, when I did my first book, I think I was somewhere around 8 or 9 hours per finished hour in the editing process, and I thought I was a good editor. To be honest with you, I prided myself on that, but there's new things to learn, and it took me that long. But let's just say it was taking someone 4 hours. If we could cut out an hour, and they're doing a 10-hour book, then that means they've saved 10 hours worth of editing time. And the recording time might have gone from an hour of recorded with click record. I call it click recording, by the way, and you call it.
Well, it depends on what your technique is. In general, in the publisher's sort of circle, when you don't stop recording and you just keep the record open, so they'll call it an open record, sometimes a straight record. That's not assuming the clicking method that you mentioned. That's just leaving it open. There are a lot of script notation, kind of things involved in that.
Okay.
So I guess I would say click recording is a kind of open record.
Okay, because I mean, when I click, to be honest with you, sometimes I would stop as well and figure
Hmm.
something out and have a drink and things like that.
Sure.
But let's just go. So we're going to talk a 4 to 1 ratio and know that if you're out there,
And
some of
that's
you are going to do
generous.
better than
That's
four to
generous.
one because that's really pretty darn good if you're a young editor to be down to 4 to 1. But we'll take those numbers. So if we can save 25%, by the time you got done with the book, the actual recording process the first time, you're going to get all your time back.
Well, don't, first of all, just to clarify,
Uh-huh.
the 4 to 1, I think, is probably a best case scenario for an open record or a click record. But when I said a quarter, I meant that editing an open record can easily take 3 to 4 times longer than
Oh, okay.
editing a punch record. So it's actually a lot more. If you've got a decent punch record and you're an experienced editor, it's possible to get a 2 to 1 ratio, meaning that if you have 2 hours of audio, it would take you 4 hours to edit it.
Okay. Well,
So,
people always want to know what's because see if I'm doing it all myself, it means that the first time I do some of this stuff, my recording time is going to go up because I'm not going to be as
oh
good at
sure,
this. I've learned something new, and that's normal. And people try this and they do 2 hours worth and they go, wow, this is terrible because now look, it took me twice as long, but you get that back on the back end. Now, what about the quality? How, you hear all these, you've done all these famous people's books, and what do you hear in terms of the difference when somebody has heard the pickup and then they're recording right after it versus people that have these other the open record, we'll call it.
it's a world of difference, as an editor. As I mentioned before, I can edit the audio, you'd be amazed at what I can do with that, but I cannot change the tone in which the actor is speaking. And the problem is when you've gotten a certain amount of distance, be it a few takes or maybe you take a paragraph completely over again, the tone does change. And that is audible. You can hear it. Um, and I think that it sort of takes away from the general cadence of speech. And I think that it distracts the listener. Like I said, they might not know what they're hearing, but they will notice it. And I think that when you punch record, and especially when you get used to it and you get comfortable with it, it really helps to hear that last sentence or couple sentences. People all have different preferences with how much pre-roll they use. Some people, when they're first starting out, they use more. You might go back a few sentences. You get the groove, and then you keep going when you're ready. Um, and it really helps you to be able to have that reference and to be able to hear what you did before so that you can continue on seamlessly.
Okay. Well, I know that over time I've settled on, for me personally, I like a 4 second pre-roll. And for those of you that don't know, whenever we're doing punch and roll, one of the beauties is I can configure all the good all the good software that's out there that does punch and roll allows you to configure how far back you want to go before you start recording. So in my case, mine is configured to where I have 4 seconds every time I start up. It's going to play me back the last 4 seconds. And a lot of times I'm mouthing it. Sometimes I'm even saying it out loud. It also allows me, we want to talk about this in terms of breaths, because one of the editor's nightmares is trying to make sure that between words and between sentences and between punch-ins, that the breaths work. It's very obvious at those points. People don't realize they're cutting off the breath when they're doing their new thing. But I want to make sure what's happening at those transition points are right on when I have that pre-roll. But my 4 seconds, some people only like 2 seconds. Some people like 5 seconds, and all the good software that's out there, mature software that does punch and roll, will allow you to say, experiment with it and tweak it and see what works for you. And then another feature that the really kind of the real good punch and roll has is a pre-record that you don't see. So I'm going to show you, for example, I'll just show this. I think it'll be a little easier showing it rather than, let's make sure we share this here. Share, and I want to go with this screen, and I have to pull this out of the way, and I'm giving you play-by-play because I should be smooth. Now, there's a perfect example of how punch and roll is going to be for you the first time you do it. Amanda and I are doing this live, and we didn't plan on having this group this way and not having you all in it where we can see you, so I just had to switch that. But one of the things after we're done is, because even if I set a punch point right here, so watch how when I start recording right at this point, and now that's exactly where the recording started. What wasn't obvious was behind the scenes, the software turned on the mic, and I have mine configured 2 seconds earlier, and I really needed to be right there. And I got 2 seconds of audio that could go back, and now I could start a couple seconds earlier, which just allows me to adjust. And of course, if I stopped too late and overran something on the other end, I can go to the other side and peel this back, and everything that was there before is there. Sometimes you'll end up doing a punch in, and if you're a good editor, you'll end up doing some things where you end up taking a word out of the middle, because all the good software, while I'm talking only about pre-roll, everything that's been doing this a while also does a thing where it will allow you to, one way or another, set a little start and end point, and then the recorder will start. If I flick, in this case, in this software, I change this icon here, and now you see this little region that I've drawn in here. I'm going to pre-roll before it, and when I hit that region, it'll record, and when I get to the end of it, it will stop. And I don't have to, oh, now, if you are dumb, no, if you are inexperienced, what I just did was I pressed spacebar. I did not press record. I'll do it with the mouse so you see that I'm pressing record, and then there it is, and then there it stopped. Okay?
For those people wondering, this is also possible in Pro Tools. So this is not just a Studio One feature.
Amanda, I'm gonna ask you to say that again, please.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I think I interrupted your little
No,
presentation
go
there.
for it.
I just wanted to tell people that, just so they know, this is not exclusive to Studio One. This is something that a lot of the DAWs do, digital audio workstations, for those not familiar. Pro Tools included, so that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah.
And I guess also, if it wasn't obvious, this is not necessarily just for the record, too. This is also for corrections. So,
Well, corrections are a major thing because people
mhm.
always ask, well, so what about the punch-ins on, I mean, they don't realize that when you come in 2 weeks later and go to do a punch-in, you have some additional things that are going on each file. If I had tweaked something, all the more mature software, let me see. Let me go ahead and show, and that's going to be here and here and here. All the mature software, the more advanced things, you're going to have the ability to have some sort of stack or inserts. And in this case, here are my inserts, my effects that are running on this track. When I come in 2 weeks later and punch in something, then what will happen is that all the effects that I applied to the original audio are going to be applied to this new little punch-in region, and therefore I'm going to have it sound as close as possible to the original, because not only did I get a chance to listen before it started and try to match my voicing, try to match my cadence, but then the software is going to also use the exact same effects at the exact same settings on this new piece of audio. Amanda, I miss anything there?
No, I mean that's a technique that you can also use in a lot of DAWs, and it's an interesting point to bring up in case anyone missed it. When we talk about ACX specs, which I think is another thing that we wanted to talk about at one point, it's important to remember that when you do your functions, they also have to be to spec, right? So a lot of times you'll have already submitted masters, and then you come back and you do the corrections. You need to make sure that you apply all the same effects and that you make sure that all the same specs are being adhered to, just to avoid that dreaded message from ACX, your files are not to spec. You know, everybody wants to get paid, and unfortunately, that is one of the major things that can delay that. So,
Okay. So it's, in other words, it's not just during the original recording phase, it's during the punch-in phase. And yeah, you know, I happen to have Studio One sitting here, so thankfully Amanda's making sure that you know I could care less about what you're doing. Today we're talking about using punch and roll. And now, because here's an example, there are some programs out there that don't natively do punch and roll. So there are some really clever, smart people out there that have created macros and done some nice, interesting things to simulate punch and roll, to simulate the built-in versions. Are you seeing any difference among those versus the ones that have it built in?
well, I do know that there are some people out there who have been teaching a particular technique with Audacity, I believe it is.
Yes.
And it was called, what was it called, Don? The Stair?
Oh, there's somebody that's doing something called the stair step method, and while
Right,
you're doing, I'll set up in
right.
the background so I can show it off.
Sure. So just for those of us who don't know, basically what that means is it's sort of a makeshift punch and roll where you hear on one track some audio, and then you start recording on a track underneath right after that audio ends. So you basically get stairs where the audio ends here, and then you keep going, the audio ends here, and then you keep going. Um, while I think in some ways it's better than an open record, you are getting the advantage of being able to hear your previous audio, and that is very important. But you're also dealing with a lot of tracks and a lot of opportunity for error. You think about how much people can potentially start and stop. I mean, even that piece of audio that we looked at of Dawn's, it was not very long. But in the case of difficult books, you know, sometimes it can be every minute or two that we're punching, and books are long. And you think about how many tracks now you have to move up and merge and move up and merge. You know, sentences get lost, things get cut off, breaths get cut off. You know, you have programs. I'm a Pro Tools user because I'm an engineer, and I started doing this a very long time ago. And you know, Don uses Studio One. But there are other programs and cheaper programs that also do punch and roll. Reaper, for instance, which technically you don't have to pay for at all, but even at the low license level, it's only $60. Reaper is also what Audible currently uses in pretty much all of their studios. That's what they record on. And they do almost exclusively punch and roll. Um, so my point of view on that basically is that while I understand the advantage of free, you know, $60 is not a big investment, and it's worth it for the accuracy that you'll get in return. Absolutely. Um,
And I'm gonna, Jim, can you hear me over here? Okay, so it's kind of interesting. I still can't hear you. Can you, Amanda, can you hear Jim?
I
No.
know. I
Okay.
don't. I don't think so.
And see, and what's interesting is it's not switching over to you, Jim. So we have another, Jim sent me a chat here in the middle of that while Amanda was talking.
Oh yes, I see. I'm sorry. The stair. It's regarding the stair step
Yeah, and what
editing.
happened was he just said, I used to do the stair step method with Audacity, and while it works great, it takes a lot more time than doing punch and roll. So,
Yeah.
uh, and here's the thing, you can find people out there that use all sorts of methods, and anything can work. There's no question that somebody can do something, and there's a tendency out there to try to sell everybody else on whatever I do. I mean, that's the normal thing. Somebody like Amanda, who's been around a long time, has gone through and tested out and worked with lots of people that use different programs. I have to admit, so I've been around, I've used a lot of different software. I mean, I know Audacity extremely well because I used it for a project a few years ago and ended up putting 1,000 hours into it and really understanding its details. So I know its strengths and weaknesses. And so what you're looking for, if you're looking for advice from people, is find some people that actually have used the different software that you're thinking of using extensively and they're very experienced. Because once again, anything can work. And if you're comfortable with something, any change is going to take some time and effort to make the change. So what you're looking for is after they got through it, was it worth it? And that's where your punch and roll ends up. I just don't know anybody who's gone past that tipping point and done it for 6 months that would ever go back. I've seen people that have done it for a month, people that have done it for 2 weeks, people that have done it for 10 hours who just go crazy and they end up gray haired like me. They started off totally black that day, and by the end of the first day of recording, it ends up where they're going, this is crazy. But Jim is saying here in a nice chat to me, he said, but it's worth learning. And
Well,
he's right.
and it is possible. I know some actors find it difficult, but I've done records with all different kinds of people. Some of them not even actors. I've done author records. People who've just written books and they want to learn how to record them. I even did once. I did an author record with an Iraqi vet with a traumatic brain injury, which was a very is a very difficult record to say the least. But you know what? He did punch and roll and it worked out in the end. And it was difficult, but I strongly believe that anybody is able to learn it if they put in the time. And I also believe that it increases opportunities job-wise because you think about a lot of the big people in town, like Audible. Like I said, they record basically exclusively punch and roll. It lowers your overhead because I got to tell you, it's one thing when you're doing your own editing. I mean, first of all, we've already talked about how much time it saves you, but also if you want to hire an editor like me, my punch and roll, rate is less than half of my open record rate.
Yeah, you know what? I'm the same way. So if people are talking about hiring Amanda or they're calling me, I look at it and I know how much work it's going to be. And there's this funny thing that happens with experienced editors. Not all of us, but you will get some of us that cringe when we find out that that's what somebody's using, in that if for some reason it takes more time, not more time, but it's a lot more effort. And then we are also constantly making artistic decisions on your behalf. And that's okay, because both Amanda and I have a music background. It does create a sense of timing and rhythm and poetry and spoken word, and the way that should fit together is something that I kind of feel, and I know she's great at it too, that it's a strength of mine and something that I bring to the table that many editors, they're great tech people, but they don't have that sense of the musical sense and the timing sense. Amanda does, and I do. But what you're doing when you hand over those recordings, we always tweak, even when someone's doing punch and roll, we're tweaking little things like that. But if we're putting it together, you are depending on us to do a good job on that. And while I know Amanda would do an excellent job with that, and I'm pretty strong at it, some of your editors are excellent technically, but they don't have quite that sense. And you're handing your work to them,
Mhm.
and they're going to do the best job they can, but that's not necessarily a strength of theirs. The people that do
That's
so, Amanda, what
Yeah,
am I
well,
missing there?
it's absolutely true. And, a point that you touched on and that I just want to strengthen by bringing up again is that regardless of, our ability to do it, and, we're both pretty good, blah, blah, blah. I, don't want to toot our own horns, but regardless of that, once you've taken care of the big stuff, for instance, getting out all of those extra takes, it allows us to really get into the nitty gritty. It allows us to take out all those little clicks. It allows us to do just tiny, tiny little adjustments for pacing just to make sure that everything flows perfectly. It allows us to make sure we're looking up every single mispronunciation, that we're catching every single missed word. And it's not that we wouldn't be doing that anyway, with an open record. It's just that everybody only has so much attention that they can put to different things. And when you have the big stuff taken care of, it really allows you to get in and make something perfect.
Oh, and
Um,
see, I see your cat in the background
yeah,
there, Amanda. So you don't use the dog clicker method, do you?
no.
Okay. All right. Well, Now, see, here's the funny thing for all of us who do record, have a home studio. Um, there are cats and dogs and things out there, and you know, so there's a pause spot right there if we needed one, if we had been recording, and we're recording live here, but that works for this because nobody cares. But things happen, and people don't realize the more of this you do, then the more you have these little things come up and add up. And when you're doing one book, it's one thing, and anybody can do one book. It's when you do 10 books and 20 books and 50 books, then you find out these little things keep adding up and keep adding up. Now, somebody's asked, I've got a question that comes here. I keep coming back to the same thing. Are you sure it doesn't affect my acting? When I tried it, I hate to reiterate this, but it seemed like it just got in the way of my work.
Initially, it will. Initially, like we've said before, you said you didn't want to rehash, but it absolutely will to begin with. But it's a learning curve. If you think about acting in general, or even recording, nothing's going to be perfect the first few times you do it, right? There's going to be a learning curve with anything worth doing. But eventually, I think it absolutely will not only not hinder your acting, but it will help it.
Okay, so I got a question here. Somebody said, I don't understand this on when you're doing the punch recording, how is it showing something? How can you peel back that stuff back and forth on the
because
audio?
it's because it's recording. So this is I know Don talked about it a little bit earlier. He touched on it, but just to bring it up again, this is non-destructive editing, and pretty much most DAWs do this to some degree. I know Pro Tools does it as well as Studio One. So that peeling back you can also do there. Um, Basically, okay. So let me just dial this back a little bit. So when you do a punch record in Reaper, what I love is that they have this mode called tape mode, right? And I love that it's called that because that's how you can think of non-destructive editing. If you think about it, is a bunch of pieces of tape, right? And then you stop and you place another piece of tape on top of it. Now, what's under that piece of tape there doesn't go away. It's just not the thing that you see on top. And then everything just kind of overlaps like that. So as long as you're in a non-destructive editing mode, you don't actually lose anything. And that's what's great for editing because you can always pull back. So many times when I'm editing a punch record or something of that nature, I'll say, well, I really like this second take, but the first couple words of it, maybe they're a little rushed. Maybe somebody, when they came in, they rushed a little bit, or maybe they kind of coughed, or there's just something that's not quite right. And rather than having to retake that whole sentence, I just peel back, a little bit of what we had from that take right before it, and I just merge them together. And it's a really excellent way to ensure a seamless record. So,
Great, great. Okay, well, we have questions coming in, and we could probably do this all night. But what we're probably going to do here is I'm going to ask Amanda if you have any final things that we should go over with people, and we're going to do this again another time. This was an experiment to go
oh,
live with
sure.
this. So, Amanda, is there anything that I missed or we should have gone over that things that we should be telling people in terms of punch and roll, things that could be clear? Jim, if you can chat with me if there's anything that from your perspective that I missed. Um, Amanda, anything that we should be going over?
Well, let's see our questions here.
Because I'm
Well, someone does talk about another software that we can recommend. Obviously, we would both recommend, our programs of choice, mine being Pro Tools and Don's being Studio One. I've also mentioned Reaper is a very good low-cost way in which to do a punch and roll record.
How about
So there's
Adobe
that.
Audition? Oh, I don't mean to cut you off, but a lot of people use Adobe Audition because that's a great program. And a lot of people use Twisted Wave. That's another great program.
Twisted Wave is a great program, but it doesn't do punch and roll. So I believe there are some macros that a few people have come up with. But I believe in, Don, you can correct me if I'm wrong, or someone else can if it turns out. I believe one of the problems with attempting to do Twisted Wave punch and roll is that we don't have non-destructive editing.
So in other words, you could never peel back. You could never adjust something after
I
the
think
fact.
so, but we'll want to get confirmation on that because I'm
Okay.
not entirely sure.
Okay. Yeah, one more case. I mean, Amanda and I are both very clear. We don't know everything about every piece of software while we've dealt with a
Sure.
lot of it. So if we were to say something wrong, come back and beat us up. We don't intend to act like we know everything about everything. We're trying to get some good information out here. Um, and so Adobe Audition, did you, because I know a little bit about that. From what I understand, there are macros that can do it there. I don't know in terms of, I don't think they can allow the peel back things. Um, and I should say this as a general principle. The macro solutions out there are dramatically better than not having anything. And some of them are in when life is perfect, they can do a good job, meaning that I totally nailed the new point and it all worked. Then they actually work. Where they come into issues with all the macro solutions are if I do something wrong and I want to undo it, undo is very often, from a macro point of view, there were a whole bunch of steps behind the scene. Therefore, my undo is not the same as somebody who has it built in. So a Pro Tools undo, for example, after recording something is going to be different than if someone had created a macro to do that, because what's not obvious is Pro Tools treats it all as one unit and does the undo properly. If you
Well,
can get
and
a macro solution, it can be very interesting as far as how the undos work. But so Amanda,
well, one thing I just got a Facebook message here to just talk about Pro Tools Undo. One of the great things about Pro Tools, it's a very complicated program, and I don't necessarily recommend it to all narrators. But one of the things that is great about it is that even when you undo, that audio does not go away. So basically, you have everything that you've ever recorded. Um, People might be familiar with the audio bin and also the clips that used to be regions. So it depends on which version of Pro Tools you have. But I believe as of version 10, they started calling them clips. And if you think about the tape analogy, that I brought up earlier, where I said pieces of tape sort of overlapping one another,
right?
that's what those clips are. So that's why all of that material is still there, because when you find one of those individual files, Pro Tools file, the session file is not an audio file. It's just a file, a software file that tells all the audio what to do, which is why you still have, functions like bounce and, consolidate and export and all of that, because basically what you see in a session is a bunch of different audio files being put together and laid up against each other. So,
And I will say, Studio One's the same thing. We're behind the scenes. If we looked at all those individual segments, all the audio is sitting behind the scenes in little segments, and then we look at it all as one. And there is a command that will take and make it look seamless, so that when we're done, if we choose, and Pro Tools is the same, I'm sure Reaper has this. All the programs that have been around, they create these distinct little elements and they drive a new user crazy sometimes because they're used to a program that it's all one little stream and they see all these things chopped up visually and it really their head's going to explode. But when they understand the power of them later, what those little segments allow you to do, there's a bunch of things behind the scenes that we're not going to discuss today that make those things really interesting that you can do later, including peel something back, removing one, bringing something back that was underneath it before that. And then for those, when you're at the point where you don't want to see them, it can take all of them for you and automatically make them into one seamless thing so that visually it looks like what you're used to. But I do see people all the time going, these things drive me crazy. And then they grab one and they move it. And while that's a problem to begin with, I guess I should show you, I'll show you, let me give you an example because that's a whole lot better than just gibbering about it. So let me go to screen here. And let me show you something that happens here. You see in this little element here, if I hold down a couple keys, I can within this take this audio and slide it back and forth, which means that if there's things going on behind the scenes, and this is one of the advantages of Pro Tools and Reaper and your more advanced programs. And at first, people hate that I have this little segment. There's a segment that's sitting here, and if I needed to, depending on what was recorded behind it, what Amanda was talking about, those little pieces of tape, all that audio is still back there and can be adjusted, and I could cut it in half and I could pull something out of the middle, and it allows me to fine tune, and it's really, really hard. Like I have to press two keys and drag. I know that's not really hard. I'm being sarcastic, smart aleck there. Furthermore, that you can see that when overdubbing, you have this come up all the time. A little punch in here is too quiet. If you notice this audio, let me make this bigger here for you. If this audio is recorded a month later, sometimes I'm not as loud. And you can actually see this segment here is not as loud compared to this one. Well, all the programs that allow these little pieces of tape in the background, I can go ahead and adjust each of these little segments. And that's another thing that happens forever when you're recording a punch in later. And people don't realize the difference between, I see this here,
Mm.
and I always wonder, well, wait a minute, look at the difference between that. Well, maybe
Make
it's an artistic.
make sure though, just to sorry to cut
That's
into
okay.
that.
Let me switch that
Two
back.
things.
Go.
So in Pro Tools, for people who don't know, this is called clip gain, and you can raise the gain of a particular region or clip. Um, but there are other ways to do it too, including automation. So you have to make sure that if you're using automation or something like that, that the effect that you're using is being actually put onto the audio. Because the problem is if you use automation or something like that and then you export the audio, it's not going to actually print onto that track. So
Okay.
that's something to keep in mind.
So,
And also, just because a waveform looks bigger or smaller does not mean it's going to be perceived that way. So you have to, people will look at it and they'll say, oh, well, this part is so quiet, and then they'll bring it up and it doesn't match.
right. Well, I was
Because,
just, yeah, you're totally
yeah.
right. I'm being rude because what I was just about to say was, it looks like it's quiet, but what happens if that was she said? And it was supposed to be quiet. I mean, the narrator had made an artistic choice that whatever those words were to be quiet relative to what had been before. So I can't just go drag them around and I instantly have them actually be artistic. I'm just saying that if later I find out that yes, that should have been quieter, or I was doing a punch in and I didn't match my same volume, when you have the little pieces of tape, you can adjust things, you can do some interesting things as you get more advanced. So we're getting in the weeds in terms of what the takeaway, and I'd like you
Mhm.
to summarize this afterward, is that these more sophisticated programs give you options later that if you're doing it just to stream the ones that have it all in one, then you have to jump through some other hoops to make that work. Amanda?
Yeah, just to summarize, learning new programs is not easy, and it's not easy for people who are just starting in audio, and it's also not easy for me. As an engineer, I try to make an effort to learn a new DAW or digital DAW. If you've never seen it before, it means digital audio workstation. I try to learn a new one every year or so, just to get a different perspective on things. And I got to tell you, even for me, it's hard every time, but I think the results, are worth it. And, when you're using one of these simpler programs, the learning curve might be easier, but in the end, to, finish doing what you want to do, you're going to have to learn one of the other ones anyway. And it doesn't have to be Pro Tools, it doesn't have to be Studio One, but in the long run, I think it's actually going to be easier sometimes if we just sort of buckle down and figure it out. And there are a lot of resources available too. Don is amazing, and he knows so much, about Studio One. I'm asking him questions all the time about that. There are a lot of people that know Pro Tools and all of the programs. There are a lot of resources out there. So
Oh, I'll have
nobody's.
to, I'm going to interrupt you on that. And what you should know if you're watching this is that if you need an engineer, Amanda's awesome, and you should consider, she should be one of your top, she should come to mind as if you need an engineer, call Amanda. She may or may not be available because she's got enough going on, but she's also an excellent coach. So if you need help with some different things, be sure you're checking her out because I hate to say this, she's forgotten more than most people know, and then she has the further enhancement that she has the ears from years of listening, and having the music background gives her a different set of ears than most engineers. And I'm not saying there are not some first class other good engineers out there. There are. But what you're looking for someone to take your book and take your artistic piece as a narrator is somebody else who not only has technical skills but has an artistic side to them. And that's a very small community in terms of the editors that have both of those put together, the artistic with the technical skills. So she's definitely worth somebody to, that you're checking out when you're thinking of that. So there's the end of that commercial.
Well,
Uh,
I thank you. That's really. I'm over here blushing. You can't tell because of the light here, probably. But thank you so much for saying that. But you know, yeah. See, now I completely lost my train of thought.
Okay, well, so what I'm going to do here is, Amanda and I decided we were going to do this, and we had decided early last week. We didn't announce it till yesterday because we were afraid it getting too big. We only had a few spots. We weren't planning on doing this live version here. So because we didn't plan on doing a live version for, a whole bunch of people, we had expected an interactive where they were going to be asking all us questions, and we didn't have them pre-canned here. So we had a whole different format planned, but decided that it was worth doing this and going for it this time. Now that we've done it, we will be dramatically better the next time we do it because we see how it works. We'll get our act together and be able to give you more information in less time next time we do it.
Well,
So, Amanda,
we can
any other
address
things we
some
should
of.
say before we sign off?
Well, I just wanted to say I know we got a few questions that were about editing a little bit more generally rather than punch and roll specific.
Okay, do you want to
And
do
we
you want to take a shot at them, or do we want to wait for
I'd
next
be
time?
well, we only have about 9 minutes. I didn't even think we were going to fill up the hour, and we've already gotten so close.
Do you want to do 9 minutes here? Is it worth it? Or do we want to
Well,
wait for next time?
let's see what we have. We have some questions about creating a good stack. What I think is that we should set that up for the next one.
Okay, yeah, because that's not
So
a trivial
it's a
thing, and
long, long question.
well, wait
It's
a
a
minute,
very
wait a minute.
complicated.
Can't I just put now? Wait, can't you know that I need a limiter, a compressor, maybe an equalizer, and I need an expander. Can't you take just my settings and it works for everybody?
No.
Oh,
No. Everybody's going to have, everybody's voice is different, right? If everybody's voice weren't different, we'd have one narrator in the whole world and everyone would just hire them. But, everybody's voice is unique. And as such, everybody's voice needs unique treatment. Um, and it's not even just a matter of the stack that you use in terms of the exact plugins, it's also the order. The order in which you apply them matters a lot. And it also affects the manner in which you use the plugins that come after the ones you've already used. So it's a deceptively complicated situation that is absolutely worth addressing, but I think maybe we should save something for next time.
okay. Well, I would consider those, and when we're talking about stacks, that they're interrelated items, that if you put something earlier, it's going to change, and if you switch the order of them, you will get different results even with the same settings. So
Yep,
they are interdependent, and
exactly.
what you do on one can affect the other, and what will happen is, and I see this all the time, it'll occur on the boards, a gentleman, or we'll just say it's a gentleman because the ladies are smarter than this, but a gentleman has this great results with a specific stack. And so they think, so somebody else new comes in and they're trying to be helpful. So what do? They tell the guy, here, oh, here's the perfect settings. This will make your stuff sound great. And Tony the Tiger is not there and it's not going to work that way. And so those same exact settings applied to a different voice who is lower or higher or richer or otherwise sometimes turn out to be not all that great. And then we have a further problem that many people don't hear the difference. But here's the test for if you're new to this. Listen to your books 3 months, 6 months, a year later that you recorded. And if you're like the rest of us, maybe you'll be unique. And I can't listen to the first ones I recorded. I'm sorry. I get 3 minutes into it and I want to go slit my throat and just go ahead and say, this is terrible. And it was terrible. And I'm embarrassed about it on one hand, but we all have to walk before we run. So you'll go through it and take your book that you did 3 months ago. And if you're learning and growing, even the book you did 2 months ago or 1 month ago, you'll probably have found a way to refine it. And your ears will get better, and noise and things and issues, you will get to a point where you're hearing so much. There comes a point where Amanda and I have this weird thing. We leave things in our audio that we hear because we're at a stage, we have the equipment and the training that we hear things, and I go, no one will hear that in the end. And I just have to leave it because if I really had it perfect, it's a whole different level. When you're doing music, you expect people are going to listen to a great song 20, 40, 200 times. They hear everything because they'll be listening to it 20 years later if it was a good recording. Today, I'll go back and listen to something that was in the 70s or the 80s that was really good. An audiobook is going to be listened to once, maybe twice. I don't know. If you have some hit, maybe it's three times, but I end up leaving little stuff because I know I
Well,
can't do everything.
and
What about you,
another,
Amanda?
well, absolutely. And it really varies based on industry too, because some people might not know this, but in addition to books, I also edit video game dialogue. I worked on Telltale's Walking Dead game, if anyone's played that. TV, film and all that, and it's different in everything. There are some industries where you leave in more, like film, because there are so many other things, and maybe you don't hear every little thing. In a book, and same with games sometimes, but in a book, the voice is it.
Yeah.
So you take out as much as you can, but another thing to address is volume. Books are long. Pretty much every book you will ever record is longer than the longest album. So there's just, from a practical standpoint, you can't take out everything. And my rule of thumb for that is generally take out what's inconsistent. If you go through and you try to take out every breath, you're still not going to get every breath. And now you're going to create a system where the breaths you've left in are inconsistent because of all the other ones you've taken out. And they end up standing out more, whereas before they would have just sounded, as if they were a part of the natural flow of the sentence.
Okay.
Um, Same thing with pacing. I know somebody who uh, would go through a particular narrator's material and shorten up every time they said, he said, you know, like, welcome to this webinar, he said, and they would shorten that up. And it's the same thing where you're just creating more work for yourself. Everybody has a different narration style. Some people are going to speak more quickly, some people are going to speak more slowly. The main thing is that it be consistent and not jarring and not, and this actually speaks a lot to punch and roll. What we've been talking about is that when you are punch and rolling, you can keep that consistency and you can keep that flow in a way that's, comforting to the listener. Whereas when you're editing something that's kind of all over the place, like a lot of open records tend to be, it's very hard to achieve that consistency.
Okay. Well, here's a question real quick, and this will be the last question of the night. If I'm only editing my own stuff and my mom tells me it's really good, which she does, is that mean that I have met the standard and I should believe that? Because one of the things I do sometimes find out is that people who primarily edit their own stuff, no one's willing to tell them. I mean, listen, if somebody asks me how it is and I'm not being paid, I find the good things that I like about it and I emphasize those. I mean, that's my policy. If I'm not being paid, I don't tell you. I mean, it's just kind of rude for me to go, well, hey, I hear this, I hear this, I hear this cut point, I hear that cut point. I don't do any of that if I'm not being paid. If I'm a paid advisor, if I'm coaching somebody, I'm brutally honest with those people because they've asked for that. But that's a different thing. Now, how about you? Are you telling people when you hear things in their audio? I'll bet you're just really mean to people and telling them that's really terrible, right? I mean, do you tell them the truth? Is the real question I'm asking you.
It depends on the situation. Some people, if you've followed some of the things that I've said in forums, I can occasionally be blunt, although I like to think in a kind way. Um, but it depends. It depends a lot more on what they can do about it. For instance, if I'm QCing a book from a major publisher and I know that it's already been recorded, it's already been edited, am I going to write back to them about every punch point I can hear and tell them? No. There's no point in that. But I will. I've always been a huge punch and roll proponent, even when it's unpopular, even when people say they don't want to do it. I truly believe that it's the best way to the highest quality.
Okay.
Um,
So in other words, you're nice, but occasionally you're occasionally brutally honest if it's called for, right?
if I think that there's an opportunity for positive change, if I think my being honest is going to make somebody's life better, then yes.
Fantastic.
Um,
And it's the same with me. If I can help someone and tell them something that's actually going to be beneficial, fine. But really, a lot of times I'm listening to something and I realize, if I tell them that's quote bad or could be better, or maybe they want need to get an evaluation. So the takeaway from that is hire Amanda or somebody who's equivalent and let them evaluate your work. And I promise you that they will give you 4, 5, 10 suggestions, things that you could improve, and that next month you'll be dramatically better.
I
So,
mean, yeah, I mean, exactly. I just wanted to say that, I think that people tend to take an if it ain't broke, don't fix it, point of view where, well, nobody's ever complained. Well, that might be. But just because somebody hasn't complained doesn't mean that they haven't thought this could be better. Be it a client, maybe a customer, downloading a book, they might not, although it is shocking how many people do seem to have the time to write really bizarrely long negative reviews, as we all know, in this industry, there are a lot more people who don't, and something might just rub them the wrong way, and they don't, think about it afterwards.
okay.
Um,
Yep, I'm agreeing with you totally. I just find that everybody's kind of like my mom, where if they're not paid advisors or something, they have a tendency to be nice. They're not, there's narrators. They're not going to tell me how bad something is unless they think that they can affect change. So,
well, and
final thing.
here's and just in terms of hiring editors, a lot of you probably know Mr. Jeffrey Kafer. Shout out because I work with him all the time, and he's always been a huge proponent of this. Um, People tend to think of looking for outside editing help as something that costs them money, but it can actually make things cheaper for you. If you think about, what you're getting paid per finished hour versus what you have to pay an editor per finished hour, which is always less than you guys are getting paid per finished hour, as it should be. Um, it frees you up. It allows you to get more work. It allows you to do more marketing and advertising. It's something to think about. It's an investment in a business, and
Right.
it also gives you a chance to relax a little bit, maybe.
Okay, well, we appreciate all of you showing up at this one. What we need, of course, now you can be brutally honest, okay, because you can send us private messages and tell us what you thought. We will do our own evaluation of this and tear it apart in terms of, oh, that was terrible. We want to make it better, and what you will see is next time we do this, it will be stronger, cleaner, better, more information in less time. We're committed to making this better. We're happy that you spent the time with us. I had fun, and I hope you did too. And if you have other questions, you can find us on Facebook, send us email. I don't do smoke signals very well anymore. It's got to be during the day, solar eclipse at the right time. But if that's not happening, one
Carrier
way or another,
pigeons,
it's just a little sorry.
maybe.
What's that?
Carrier pigeons, maybe.
Carrier pigeons, yeah. I said, sometimes I have a dog that might eat those, but just keep them away from the
I have
tub.
three
And
cats, so you never know.
all right. Well, we appreciate all of you spending your time with us. We didn't go over everything, but if you have other questions, let us know because we'll be doing another one of these, and we look forward to seeing you on the wires. Have a great night. Bye bye.
Take care.